You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a podcast by some guys who at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for episode 369 is something like, can we base ethics on the model of biology? And we read the first 4 chapters or so of Philippa 2001 book, Natural Goodness. For more information about the text and the podcast, please see partiallyexaminedlife.com. This is Mark Linsenmeyer in Madison, Wisconsin, rating myself pretty good when it comes to having developed to maturity, sustained myself to date, and reproduced.
This is Seth Paskin, impractically rational, in Austin, Texas.
This is Wes Alwan, depending directly on my relation to my life form in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
All right, we got the classic group, the original.
The natural group, we might want to say.
Dylan is vacationing today. It is Memorial Day as we're recording this. And this reading makes me memorialize. Alistair MacIntyre just died, and we're again returning to some neo-aristotelianism. I thought we were maybe going to spend some more time in so-called modern philosophy back, contemporaries of Hume. But Wes, your fancy has chased out ahead, and we have the next couple readings picked out in this area of modern, late 20th century, or in this case, 2001, ethics, which is a fine thing to have a bunch of episodes on. And she's basically playing in an area that we're familiar with from Aristotle, although then, there are other people she's reacting to. Yeah. Say a little about why this book, why now?
Yeah, I don't remember why I started reading this. I was looking at different 20th century classics that I thought were very readable and interesting and related to some of the issues that have been raised with reading Hume. And I thought that Philippa was just very fun to read. Now, my second reading, I have to say, reading her a second time and taking notes, I find it quite difficult. I find her slippery in a way with her arguments in a very analytic philosophy type of way. But in general, I was surprised to find myself enjoying her and then Korsgaard, who people I think would be categorized as analytic philosophers. I just found it very pleasurable to read. And I felt like I was learning something, or at least on my way to learning something about the things that are fundamentally puzzling in this area.
It's also, we just read Hume, right? And it's, at least in some sense, directly a response to the Humean tradition.
Yes, Hume as seen through historically. We brought up our old ethical intuitionism episode, and actually that's what concluded with MacIntyre, not as an intuitionist, but sort of as, I'm not sure, I forget how we added that, but the idea that when Hume makes this is-ought distinction leads to the idea that, well, moral evaluations, or really just evaluations at all, are quite different than other kinds of statements of just pointing out facts. So even if I give you reasons for doing something, you could just always reject those reasons and say, you're not appealing to my values. So there's always this jump, and that moved, with G.E. Moore to, well, there's a special kind of fact, that we have a special moral sense that detects this sui generis kind of fact, and it's a non-natural fact, right? Hume wants to base everything he's arguing in naturalism, in the kind of stuff that natural science looks at. What sentiments do we find that we have? It doesn't mean they're all physical. They could be psychological facts. That's fine. But it's all within the natural realm. And so we get this idea of non-naturalism that sort of G.E. Moore, this was hugely influential, that there must be some special, not magical, not supernatural, but just something that, it's kind of like one of those anti-scientism kind of arguments. There are certain things that the natural science just doesn't touch, and morality is one of them. And then apparently this got further, we read Stevenson in that run, in that same episode that we did more, who just said that a moral claim is a separate kind of utterance in that it is just expressing it's saying yay, the yay or boo. So it's an exclamation. It is not actually saying any fact at all. It's not pointing out some non-natural moral fact of the goodness of something. It's just saying, in effect, I approve of that thing. So it's a performative. It is an utterance. So it's a completely logically distinct. And this is the kind of things that Foote is now responding to. She wants to get back to naturalism, say, no, actually, there is something there are matters of fact that are very relevant. There's no sharp fact value distinction. And it is not a matter of merely, subjectively saying, I approve of this. There are moral facts. And it ends up getting us, as we would predict with most of these 20th century people, back to a new version of Aristotle, that there's a telos, there's an inherent goodness, the right natural goodness to certain kinds of evaluations. But it's just, she is much more careful. Like we did this when we did Nietzsche originally, where, evaluation is not puzzling to us. We do it all the time. And we might do it in the case of things that don't seem moral at all. For an animal or plant, what makes it a good specimen of its type? Well, is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is it pursuing its natural goals? Is it strong and vigorous? And Nietzsche looked at that and said, well, that's what we should do for humans. What are we? We're will to power. How well are we enacting that? How well are we being that kind of thing? And so that's basically the kind of thing that Foote is going on. But she actually is going to respond to objections in a way that Nietzsche just, states his view and is very artistic about it. Foote is actually in the middle of professional philosophers arguing about these things. So that's very valuable in itself.
Yeah, she starts out by responding to what she thinks of as a neo-Humean tradition in expressivism or prescriptivism, Mark, as you just described it, which involves an appeal to this idea that, and it's broadly a part of non-cognitivism, which is to say our moral evaluations are not facts. We don't cognize them, but they're not like beliefs about facts. But I think the way she ends with her kind of description of non-cognitivists, she ends with prescriptivism. So it's not that just when we make a moral evaluation, we're saying, I don't like this. We're kind of saying you shouldn't like this either. Although the word should, right, becomes problematic there. But
I am recommending this to you.
We're trying to, I want to make you have my feeling. Let's put it that way. You can see the complexity of this because the minute you say, I think you should feel that way, you kind of get back into the problem. So I think this, right, and Hume understood this because Hume tries to make it very clear that he's not just reducing morality to your own particular sentiment about something. You might not like someone and they might be thwarting your interests, but that doesn't rise to the level of immorality. Your sentiment has to be connected to this impartial point of view or this kind of third person point of view that you inhabit.
I would argue cheering and booing is itself, it's never just like, I approve of this. No, it is, this is awesome. It is, it's very oppressive to be booed. It is
and arguably you could say if you are cheering a team on, you are encouraging others to do the same, let's say, yes. Or you're trying to piss off the opposition. Mm-hmm. You're going against the people who are cheering for the other team. But in any case, this, the non-cognitivism and expressivism, prescriptivism in particular, they take the expression or endorsement of feelings or attitudes as crucial. They take some internal psychological state of people as crucial to explaining morality. And we can see a connection because those sorts of things do reflect tendencies to act. And for someone like Hume, action must ultimately be connected to feeling. But Foote is going to try and flesh out a different theory where we can actually respond to reasons. We can have reasons to act that are not reducible to feelings. We can think of action as occurring just based upon beliefs about the way things are, in particular about whether life forms are performing their functions properly, let's say. So, for instance, we can say things like the tree's roots are good because, for an oak tree, its roots go deep and it anchors it in the soil and gets it the nutrients they need. And if they're not that way, then they're defective or they're unhealthy. And the same thing for a heart. Your heart is for pumping blood through your body and keeping you alive and sending oxygen to your red blood cells. And if it's not doing those things, it's a bad heart. And those sorts of, are they factual? Is she slipping in illicit, evaluative language there? We can argue about that. But those sorts of what she wants to see as factual judgments can form the basis of ethical judgments, she thinks.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've explicitly laid out the context there a little bit, but I feel like there's a little more color, particularly to like the oak tree example. So She says of the oak tree, we can say it's a good oak tree if it has thick and deep roots as opposed to shallow and small roots. Okay, why is that a criterion for being good when it comes to being an oak tree? Well, because oaks are not like reeds. Oaks are stiff and thick, and they don't bend in the wind. So if the tree is going to survive a windstorm or, have some kind of longevity or whatever, it needs to have strong roots. Okay, so it's not that the having of roots is good. It's that having of roots means that it has the strength to withstand storms. And having the strength to withstand storms means longevity or resilience to potential ending of existence, life. So really what we have to do is we have to follow the chain of reason or the chain of causes or linkage of whatever that gets you from the criterion that we say is good, which is really a shorthand for saying this criterion will help this thing live a long time, become the best tree that it can be, or the best rabbit or the best lion or whatever, and presumably reproduce. And perhaps some other things, or perhaps you can roll those up into a higher order thing. But ultimately, that's what we're talking about here, because we don't want to say the fact that it has deep roots means that we make a jump to a normative claim.
I think you're right. She gets into what she calls Aristotelian categoricals, and this is meant to, this is the connection you're making, Seth, where we have to be able to say something about the species in order to evaluate individuals. Individuals are held against the standard of the species, and in particular, the self-maintenance and reproductive capacity of the species. So there's species level maintenance, which is reproduction. There's individual self-maintenance, which is cells dividing or just staying alive. So a very Aristotelian idea in that your biological functions and organs and parts help you continue to be what you are, and maybe to be more actualized as what you are than you might otherwise be. So the whole point of roots is to anchor you into the ground and also to nourish you, because without that, you cease to be an oak tree. You die. And it's not, as she'll later say, that it's bad from some kind of utilitarian sense if tree dies as opposed to living. It's not like, it's a bad thing for trees to die. No, it's just that we look at the individual against the background of the life cycle of its species. It's a bit mysterious whether we can legitimately retrieve normative language from that, right? Because we know that evolution, it's not intelligent design, but its designs look intelligent. And so we always have to ask ourselves the question, well, is a heart for beating? In one sense it is, but it's not for beating in the sense that it was designed to do that by someone.
Yes. And I felt like this was a good distinction, wants to distinguish between primary teleology and secondary teleology that usually explain what teleology means by talking about like a knife. It is for cutting. Well, the knife has no internal structure such that it tries to cut, or it has a natural growth toward cutting or something like that. That's just something we use it for. And so likewise, even animals, like, yes, there's the way that they grow big and strong, and that what makes for a good cattle to bring to market or whatever is not necessarily the same thing as what makes for the healthiest variety. I mean, what makes for a good veal is not a healthy animal at all. But there's also this distinction between the benefit of the individual animal or plant or person and its telos, that it's not, because you mentioned reproduction, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to fit into its ecosystem. So she's like, if wolves survive by cooperating, and so a well-functioning wolf, is there something wrong with that wolf? It's a loner. I know we say lone wolves, but she says, no, wolves are pack animals.
Free riders, she says, right?
Exactly, yes.
He's not helping with the hunt, but he's eating the meat.
Right. You might think that actually the most awesome wolf would be the one that is so successful that all the other wolves do the hunting and just bring him the stuff because he or she is so attractive or whatever. But no, there's something wrong with that.
Are we pretending that the alpha in a wolf pack might be female, Mark? I thought the days of
I don't know ways that wolf societies
Wolf
could go
gender
wrong.
politics were over.
Yeah, so she then takes seriously. I mean, right? Nietzsche will say all that kind of stuff, and then like, yeah, if we don't understand that our excellence is similar to that analogy work, then there's something wrong with us. We've gotten ripped from our roots. But she wants to really acknowledge that, of course, introducing rational choice. I mean, it's not just, of course, Aristotle does this too. Aristotle says we're social animals. So like the wolves, we do have the similar thing. And we're also rational creatures. So yeah, we're, of course, it's not just the way that we happen to grow. The way that we happen to grow for our excellence is to be able to make rational, informed choices in a way that animals can't. But I think Foote really wants to seriously consider what that actually means, that this raises the whole set of objections against teleology, which seems to center it on, as you know, Nietzsche gets this criticism, perhaps legitimately, a very self-interested, self-centered, like, well, that's not moral. That's not what would make somebody good morally. The best person morally is the saint, is somebody that does everything for other people, is somebody that can set aside the common failings that we have. But she wants to take those objections seriously, but still argue that no, actually, the human goodness is the analogy between moral types of goodness and non-moral types of goodness is a strong one. That if somebody is, I like the response, if somebody's rude to me, or to at least I think this, and I kind of want to say, like, what is wrong with you? Like, who hurt you? Who made you the kind of obnoxious person that thinks that what you just did to me is a normal thing to do in a public space? And I think that's entirely in the spirit of her arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this first chapter, she's kind of foreshadowing where she's going with a concept of practical rationality that is not connected, as non-cognitivists think, to individual desires or attitudes. So this is what, you know, and she'll say, where non-cognitivists try to account for the action guiding character of moral judgments via attitudes, right? Just in the way that Hume did. What she calls practical rationality can do that, even though traditionally practical rationality, right, has been associated with hypothetical imperatives and desires, right? I desire this. Rationally, I know that if I'm hungry for the sandwich and it's in the fridge, I got to go to the fridge and take the sandwich out and put it in my mouth to satisfy my hunger. That's practical rationality on the traditional account. And it only gets off the ground if you have some goal or end state that you desire. Otherwise, it doesn't get off the ground. But she wants to get us used to this idea that we can have reasons to act which are not simply a means to fulfilling our desires. They could be reasons to act that follow from this, you know, natural facts about goodness, as she's gonna say. So she lays out a little bit of this concept of practical rationality in the first chapter.
There's another way she puts it in the chapter when she's talking about practical rationality is she says, you know, the tradition following Hume relies on the idea that we're self-interested rational actors. And so ultimately, what you're saying, I just want to use a slightly different language so we don't get hung up on the word desire, but that she's trying to say you can explain morality, moral choices, and so on without recourse to an individual actor's self-interest, I think is another way to say that.
There are always two elements, and this comes from Hume, desire and self-interest, and they're not the same thing. And because Hume wants to say everything is related to desire, but he's against the idea that it's all simply related to self-interest. He's an anti-egoist, but he's into the desire theory. So we can have fundamentally other regarding sentiments, but they are plugged into our desires, but they are not necessarily self-interested. Just wanted to make that clarification. That's why she includes both those categories in her account.
Yeah, I like sentiment a little better than desire because in some of our moral judgments, it doesn't translate exactly into our acting to attain that thing or acting to, you know, having any desire whatsoever regarding it. It's just that we approve of it.
The word she's using is attitude. You know, we could keep that, but I was just using desire to be a little bit more concrete for listeners. But yeah, attitude as in something, or sentiment as in something related to desire or self-interest or some other quote unquote passion, to go back to the Humean terminology.
Just to put this in the context of her corpus, So she passed away in 2010, I saw. And this is kind of her magnum opus, I believe, because she'd published a lot of articles going all the way back to 1959 is her first really famous one, but hadn't written a whole book before. So I think this is the attempt to sort of synthesize a lot of different things that she'd written about. She has this 1972 article, Hypothetical Imperatives, that she refers to several times, and she kind of rips on it as, oh, I was too much of a Humean back then. I actually read that article and I thought it was very on point. I thought it was very illustrative, right? The fact that we're talking about imperatives, most of this reading, Natural Goodness, sounds like Aristotle, and she's playing in the general area that Aristotle laid out. But as soon as you're talking about practical reason, of course, Kant comes to mind for me. And so that's the focus of Hypothetical Imperatives article, is arguing that like Kant was wrong, that it doesn't have to be that we just have no reasons at all. That I would just, when you do something for morality, then the only reason is just for morality's sake, for duty's sake, that is the only legitimate reason. And any other reason, any self-regarding or just situational reason, anything that comes from the empirical world you would cite, well, that's impure. That's the distillation of, that is a merely hypothetical imperative. And I think we could see these teleological views as still basically hypothetical imperatives, right? If you want to be a good example of your type of creature, then this is what you should do. It's just that we don't have to ask that question if you want to be. It is built into you. It is your nature to already want to do that, to already be responsive to reasons relevant to that. So that certainly if somebody asks you, why should I bother to be healthy? Like, well, only a sick person would ask that question, according to Nietzsche. But the thing that again, Foote wants to take on very straight is, well, there is still the question, okay, you've described what goodness is to me. Why should I bother to pursue that? And it is true that the sort of specifically moral virtues get balanced against all these other considerations when we are coming up with reasons for doing something. But just the fact that we're coming up with reasons and moral reasons can be among them, I think it means there's not this sharp distinction that Kant made between, well, there's the if-then reasoning, the actual practical reasoning, versus, well, you just have to do this, which is what morality is for him.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear with Kant, right? To do something out of duty, it just means that it's inherent in willing itself, that certain things follow from willing itself at risk of self-contradiction.
Yeah.
And so it would be irrational, ultimately, not to do a thing because you'd be essentially contradicting yourself if you did it, right? Like lying, the self-contradiction lies in imagining a society in which everyone lies, and then lying doesn't make any sense because it doesn't do you any good. So it's really all about, it's a pretty ingenious account to retrieve some role for rationality in morality, right? Because all the other stuff that Hume was attacking, right? Oh, there's a principle out there and, you're in accord with the principle or something like that, is very puzzling. It's not an effective way to try to get rationality into the picture.
Let's stop for a sponsor break. Last night, my wife and I were hanging out with another couple. Now, it'd been a few months since we'd seen them, and the wife had been laid off from the corporate tech job earlier this year. Having been in similar positions in the past myself, we got to talking about how we'd never go back to corporate America, and she and her husband shared that they felt the answer for them personally was to start a business themselves. They've got ideas and a lot to figure out. Fortunately, however, many things that would have been a headache for the aspiring entrepreneur not too long ago, a website, payment system, branding, advertising, customer retention, online sales, are made easy to stand up and simple to manage with today's sponsor, Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started to hometown Austin, Texas brands like Tomlinson's. And what if I can't design a website? Or what if you can't design a website? Shopify's got you covered with beautiful, ready-to-go templates to match your brand style. Need a hand? Get help with everyday tasks like enhancing product images, writing product descriptions, or generating discount codes with Shopify's AI tools created for commerce. What if people haven't heard about your brand? Shopify helps you find customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. And what if you get stuck? Shopify is always around to share advice with their award-winning 24/7 customer support. Turn those dreams into and give them the best shot at success with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/PEL, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/PEL. Shopify.com/PEL, all lowercase.
I think if you say morality is a system of hypothetical imperatives, you're just going back to Hume, and maybe you don't go so far as the non-cognitivists as the expressivists. That's debatable. But I don't think you have something much different from a Humean account, which is now, right, which is where she was in her hypothetical imperatives article, and now she wants to argue in the opposite direction.
So
do we want to finish her account in the first chapter, just laying the groundwork?
Sure. This was the most difficult part of it because it was reacting to all these contemporary philosophers, right? The prescriptivists that we didn't read, and sort of making some subtle points. Whereas then once she, it's called a fresh start. Once she brushes that away, then what she tries to build in terms of let's just talk about biology for a whole chapter. And then let's say, ask about how the move from animals and plants to people, does that actually work? Where do they, all that was very clear. But yes, sure, go ahead. We'll pursue her own ordering here to see. Yeah,
so it's on page 9 to 10, and I think we've covered this pretty well, that she talks about her own previous flirtation is not the right word, I guess, but because she probably held this view for a long time. But the fact that she previously held this view that to be action guiding, moral judgments must be related to attitudes, which means, again, broadly speaking, desire or self-interest. Now she thinks it's a mistake. And then it's in, I think, page 10 to 11, where we start to get some of the complexity, because she wants to say that basically the practical rationality is not something that can just be independent of morality. My desire is to achieve vengeance, and therefore I'm going to go out and kill someone. That's just as good an application of practical rationality as I want to help people, so I'm going to go do another thing, right? I just have different desires. Some are good desires, some are evil desires, but practical rationality applies in each case. In pages 10 to 11, she's going to introduce us to the idea that actually a good will is somehow going to be a condition of practical rationality itself. So even if you are good at being a thief, you know a lot about being a thief, you know all the techniques, you know all the hypothetical imperatives. It's like the thief's hypothetical imperative guidebook. You've read it all. That doesn't mean you have good practical rationality relative to your desire to rob, because practical rationality cannot be detached from the concept of a good will. And having a good will is foundational to practical rationality. Now, I think it's a bit confusing, because at this point, she's only going to tell us these things without really arguing for them. But yeah, here she says, goodness of choice and the will is prior to and the ultimate criterion of practical rationality.
Right. I think we can give away some of the details that she eventually leads us to, that there's the sort of all things considered, what should I do? And it's not the case, as Kant would say, that the moral always wins out over every other consideration. She gives an example of, I'm feeling sick, I should stay in bed. That's not a moral imperative. That's just a prudential imperative. But there's something that I promised to do. I will be breaking my word if I don't get up and do it.
Well, I wouldn't use the breaking the word example, because you're importing morality into that. I need to deposit something in my...
This is a variation on this she gives a little later. Yes, there's considered different conflicting practical things. But yeah, she eventually argues that it can be the case that we are justified in overruling morality with non-moral considerations. And that's just part of practical morality, and that there's nothing wrong with that. That it's one whole system, that if we are, that I think, as Aristotle described, that it is how well we function in the world, and our goodness that is being evaluated, just like the tree's roots, is the capacity of our will. Do we do the thing that a wise person in this situation with a lot of relevant experience would choose to do. And that ultimately is not that she's just saying that's what we should call moral, because she recognizes like there's a tradition of separating moral and prudential, but she wants to, her ultimate vision is going to be to shove those together. So it's very un-Kantian, even though you've been describing it in a very Kantian way in many respects.
Yeah, I think another way to foreshadow this, where she gets us by the end of chapter 4, is to say that I think we're going to think of practical rationality as one among the virtues, which is to say one among the kinds of capacities that are analogous to roots in plants, such that there's a natural fact about what practical rationality looks like if it's healthy versus unhealthy. Let's just use that language, or if it's, if it's functioning well in us or not functioning well. And that includes, both these, it includes considerations relative to self-interest. It includes considerations relative to desire, to other interest, but it also just includes certain considerations just by virtue of the nature of the kinds of beings that we are. We're the kinds of beings who make promises, for instance. That's part of our practical rationality to take that sort of thing into account. We'll get into that in more detail, but I just thought if we're foreshadowing, where she's going. But it is, I think it's helpful to foreshadow here because it is, this first chapter, I think, is quite confusing, but before we start getting the fuller account of what she's onto.
I'm not sure if we've explicitly talked about, so page 9, she's saying, right, the really good thing about Hume, as opposed to Kant, is maybe it's in Kant too, but it's the practicality requirement. So the whole reason she's doing is that there needs to be a built-in motive to recognizing something as good, to doing it, that merely saying there's a fittingness to the gratitude and beneficence that doesn't actually tell us, well, you should actually go do that. It doesn't give us the motivation to do that. But if we are engaged in practical reasoning, well, that's all about coming up with reasons to do stuff.
Yeah. And I think this is something we forget about, over the years. I think, we've, of course, used the word practical to refer to the side of philosophy that deals with ethics, and theoretical, right, to deal with metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of science, things like that. But I think we forget that practical, what does practical mean? It doesn't mean what we mean in everyday life, which is that it would be impractical to do this and practical to do that. It means, and Hume is sort of the ancestor for all of this. It means that we're talking about action guiding reasons. We're talking about reasons that can lead us not just to believe things, as on the theoretical side, but reasons that can actually lead us to do things. And Hume's claim is reasons to do things must ultimately boil down to something with an attitudinal or cognitive state. We're not going to be moved simply by facts, by beliefs about facts. And again, this is the thing that she's going to challenge here.
Reasons are never in themselves self-motivating. We have to want the thing that the reason, but she says, like, you could still say, I want to do the reasonable thing, but you're just restating it in terms of, I recognize the reason and it motivates me. It's not about, I'm reacting to my want. Yes, Seth, you seem to really like that aspect of Hume. What do you think of her tossing that away?
Well, I guess given that she's trying to expand the notion of the types of reasons that can be considered in a moral judgment. So it's, first of all, you can take into consideration things which are not simply self-interest, like the greater good or whatever. And then you can also, she wants to be able to say, you can do something that you don't want to do. You can be motivated in a certain sense against the self-interested reason or something like that. And so she's trying, I think, to give a account of maybe more complex or, not even corner cases, because I do get the sense that she just thinks that the notion that morality is all and only about practical reason with respect to self-interested beliefs is just too narrow. And it can't really explain. It's not just that it's wrong. It can't even explain all the phenomena.
Well, but Hume is against that point of view as well, right? So Hume argues against this concept that self-interest is what ultimately guides action, because we have lots of other interested sentiments. But also, Hume will also say we do things that we don't want to do in some larger sense. So we force ourselves to do things that are in the near term unpleasant, but we do that because we have an idea about some anticipated larger state of, pleasure or state of well-being or something like that. So Hume can explain doing things you don't want to do. He can explain doing things that are not in your self-interest and still do it with this attitudinal theory or theory of sentiment that Foote wants to discard here. So it's not strictly about performing that chore, which Hume has already done. It's about saying that we can have reasons for action that look more like reasons for belief. We can have reasons for action that aren't derivative, or in other words, that function without inducing attitudes in us, desires or whatever, that then push us, right? Like to do something. Like it's not enough to have a belief, but the belief has to somehow interface with us in such a way that it pushes or pulls us in a certain direction, which is where desire or some other attitude comes in. She's saying we can do without that sentimental structure somehow, which is really kind of baffling. And I think this is one of the reasons why I got interested in this book and the Korsgaard. I'm interested in this alternative idea, which I still find quite baffling, that we can be motivated by reasons to act which are not somehow connected to our desires or attitudes. But they can be action guiding. We can say, okay, I see that this is the case. This is the way things are, and therefore I should do X, without it going through some psychological state that must be used to explain how a belief can put me into a state of action. Because Hume knows, right, beliefs can put us into a state of action. He just thinks that desires have to interface with them. I see the cake. I know there's a piece of cake there, but I'm not going to go for the cake if there isn't some inherent attitude in me, which is cake-driven, pushes me towards the cake. By itself, the belief in the cake, if there weren't a pre-existing desire for things like cake, couldn't pull me towards the cake, right? Do you get the idea here? This is what's so baffling about it. But there are certain types of beliefs and reasons, she's saying, that can make us do that, are action guiding somehow without that internal drive. Or maybe it's an internal drive, but it's a different type of internal drive.
Okay. I'm now questioning my entire interpretation of what I read. So I'm trying to look back and look at my notes and say, okay, I see the part where she says, I now believe that both the self-interest theory of rationality and the theory of rationality as desire fulfillment are mistaken. Moreover, there seems to be a mistake of strategy involved in trying to fit the rationality of moral action into either theory. Such an enterprise implying that first we come to a theory of rational action and then try as best as we can to slot in the rationality of acts of justice and charity.
You understand what that means? The theory of rational action just means that it doesn't have to be justice or charity. It could be, how do I rob or kill someone? And rational action is just about the best way to do that. That's what's rational, is the means to the ends. What's rational is to have a nice sharp blade that I can put right into someone's heart. It's practical rationality at work, just to make it very, very vivid. But she doesn't like that detachment between practical rationality and morality. And then, because once we say that, for rationality is good for all kinds of things. It's good for evil as just as much as it's good for good. But then, so we start out with this kind of neutral theory of practical rationality, and then we have to try and say, okay, well, why would anyone have morality as a goal then? Because they could just as much use their weapon of practical rationality as evil as for good. And then we're stuck because we don't know how to say why they would just use it for good. So we kind of have to say goodness is built in there from the ground up and as part of that tool.
Okay. So essentially what you're saying is that she's saying if you only rely on moral sentiment, then you can potentially fall into the trap you just described And so there has to be something deeper. And that's where she says on 11, I want to say baldly that there's no criterion for practical rationality that is not derived from that of the goodness of the will. So really, it's like, yeah, sentiment might play a role, but it has to be the sentiment of a good person as opposed to the sentiment of a bad person, which means ultimately we have to look at what makes a good person and not focus on the sentiment aspect.
Yeah, and I don't think she thinks sentiment needs to be the driving force. But I think your interpretation, that's an intriguing option that you just presented, Seth. But
I've been trying to determine, I mean, you're taking at her word that she is straight against Hume, sort of on the Kantian side. And I see a lot of Hume, because Hume does not fall into the trap of seeing rationality as something that the villain could use to maximize, because Hume is also not a utilitarian. He's not a consequentialist. He says we could evaluate somebody's will. That is something we evaluate. I think Kant might have run with this element in Hume.
Well, I mean, Hume was read by many people as a proto-utilitarian.
I mean, he uses the principle of utility, and this is something Foote is on the lookout for as well, because, you know, what makes the tree's roots strong? What makes that a virtue? Well, because it is useful in their quest to be a strong, effective version of their type.
Well, she's not, but she wants to explicitly reject that idea. It's not just that it's useful for survival. It's that we make these categorical statements about what the species is. Trees have roots and strong roots, and that they, as part of their life cycle, they maintain themselves and they reproduce and they do this and do that. And individuals are then evaluated against that standard of the Aristotelian categorical about what the species does. And this is a really interesting point that she's making, right? Because we'll say, you know, rabbits hop, but we know that if a rabbit gets injured, it can't hop anymore, and the thing doesn't cease to be a rabbit. It's just that the species categories are normative categories. We're saying something about an evolutionary blueprint. However the individuals fall short, there is some evolutionary blueprint that is responsible for the structure of those individuals, or for what the structure should have been.
Right. It's not merely, though, that it's in the blueprint. It is that it contributes in a utilitarian sort of way to the project of what it is to be that creature. So she gives this example of a peacock that they have the male peacocks have their big tails, and those are important for reproduction. So like if a male peacock does not have that kind of tail or has a really shoddy version of that tail, then we say there's something wrong with it. It does not achieve the excellence of a peacock. But also in the genetic blueprint is, like she says, a patch on the back of their head. Maybe this is a real thing. Maybe she's making this up. I don't know. But if one particular peacock doesn't have that, it's not going to function any less well. But it is deviating from the norm. So just merely deviating from the norm is not enough. There has to be some normativity built into the teleology, and it would be hard pressed not to describe that as utility, right?
Well,
It's not the benefit of the individual. It's the utility for the project of being that kind of creature.
Let me just clarify. So, because she does this explicitly later on, which is to say, it's not that it's good to reproduce and stay alive and not go extinct as a species or not die as an individual. It's not, oh, that's a good thing, and therefore the things that serve it are good. It's just that is the thing that species do. And having the right tail for that, or the right innate disposition to take care of your young, or whatever other virtue or natural quality, the right sorts of roots to stay alive, whatever you have that serves your life cycle is good relative to the life cycle. But we don't want to say that those are just good consequences that we want. Then that's what's guiding our evaluation of the specific biological functions. It's just that's the way that species are at a life cycle level.
Right. And she plays with this idea of, how do we define what the good roots are? Well, if you were a tree, that would be the kind that you would want.
She doesn't like that example.
Right. She thinks that's a little silly.
Right.
But I just wonder if this is already in Hume, that when Hume is talking about utility, it's not just that, I'm not sure about this, right? Is it just that we have moral sentiments that approve of a vast, flourishing universe? Or are our moral sentiments built out of us as the types of creatures that we are and the kind of world that benefits us and makes us thrive and flourish and go forward in that direction? That having a society, having property laws, having all these things, he argues, on the basis of utility, help us. So I think you could interpret him teleologically just as easily as you could interpret him. I don't think he's explicitly a consequentialist. That's not the way moral sentiments work. Moral sentiments are not just about, oh, we really all like good consequences, and thus we approve of any actions and attitudes and types of people that will bring about those good consequences. He is not that. He's very much,
Yeah. I mean, he's saying, so for instance, we have an interest in justice. We have an interest in the well-being and of others and the flourishing of society. And that's built right into us at the level of sentiment. And it's not just because it helps us, but once you get into the whole concept of sentiment, I mean, there's a lot of virtue ethics in Hume too. So there is a lot of crossover, I think, as you're pointing out.
And we could admire
between these two, but I think they're different points of view, but they're not easy to disentangle. It's not. Right. It's not actually easy to disentangle any of these views, as we'll see.
Yes.
When we get to Korsgaard, there's significant overlap, it turns out, between the Kantian, Humean, and Aristotelian position. You can't actually get away from the overlap. But
yes, I think for Hume, right, there's he had whole chapters on things that we admire just because they seem to benefit that individual, not because they bring greater utility to everything. So I could, as a Humean, admire the oak and its deep roots and how useful it is to that oak, or how well crafted that oak is. It's not about overall utility and isn't it good that oaks exist or anything like that. Like the kind of thing that she explicitly argues against utilitarianism, I don't think applies to Hume. Well, let's, yes, we can talk about this more in part 2. Let's wrap up for the moment. Come back next week. If you don't want to wait until next week, become a Partially Examined Life supporter, partiallyexaminedlife.com/support. There's a number of ways, either through our website or through Patreon, that you can get part 2 either right now or very soon, within the next day in your feed. If you're just using Apple Podcasts and you just want to click that subscribe button, it won't get you the episode right now, but it will give you this and all other episodes ad-free. So that's worth doing in itself if you're too lazy to go to our website or Patreon to check out the other options. We just appreciate whether you're financially supporting us or just giving us your attention, being a part of this community. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.